So I'll be honest with you, I was going to make a video about the new Naked Gun movie, but the more I thought about it, the more and more I had to say about comedy in general. I've been really trying to wrap my head around my thoughts on the Naked Gun, and I keep coming back to wondering about the vessels with which we consume humor in the 2020s. There's this existential question in Hollywood regarding the future of the studio comedy and the death of it. And not only that, but that lingering question comes to mind. Does a comedy movie need to serve any other function than to be funny? It seems more and more that in this day and age, the answer to that question is yes. But I'll come back to that in a little bit. If you look back at the history of comedy in film, from the 70s to the 21st century, you see some absolute classics of the genre, and you could see how the genre has morphed over time. You start with the likes of Mel Brooks, then you get the Zaz films, Harold Ramis, the Farrelly brothers, Judd Apatow, Adam McKay, Todd Phillips. They all seem to be pushing the genre into new territory with each decade. And then you throw in a handful of other unique voices like Wes Anderson, Jared Hess, Kevin Smith, Ben Stiller, Edgar Wright, Taika Waititi, and you could clearly track the changing tides of comedy. Over the past decade or so, one shift in the comedy landscape has emerged: the rise of what some might call trauma coms. These are films, TV shows, other works that blur the line between comedy and emotional reckoning, where laughter becomes a coping mechanism. Shows like Fleabag, Barry, BoJack Horseman, and Bo Burnham's Inside lean heavily into the tension between pain and humor, between performance and breakdown. These aren't just about sad clowns. They're comedians and creators who are increasingly comfortable folding existential dread, mental illness, and personal baggage into the structure of a comedy. And not only that, but I recently went through my head thinking of some of the theatrical comedies from 2024, setting aside the likes of Deadpool and Wolverine. And I came up with Honora, A Real Pain, Saturday Night, My Old Ass, all a bunch of films that one could argue are more comedy adjacent. And this trend arguably reflects a broader cultural movement, particularly among younger audiences who gravitate toward content that feels emotionally real, even when it's absurd. But this also complicates how we think about comedy as a genre. If everything has to be emotionally grounded or narratively rich to justify its value, where does that leave the breezy, joke-a-minute spoof? The Airplanes and the Naked Guns of the world weren't interested in bearing their souls. They just wanted to make you laugh until it hurt. But maybe in an age where everything already hurts, comedy is adapted to reflect that truth back at us. For me, Airplane was the first movie I saw as a kid that I can remember laughing hysterically at. And then I sought out the work of Mel Brooks. History of the World Part 1 and Spaceballs were seminal films from my youth, so the spoof comedy genre has always been near and dear to my heart. And there was a time where I would have believed that a reboot of a classic Zaz comedy would have been a disaster in this trauma-com era that we find ourselves in, one where things need to feel elevated or pushing the genre forward in order to be notable. Case in point, Friendship from earlier this year. I loved Friendship for almost the exact opposite reasons that I also love this new Naked Gun reboot. And yes, I did love it, but with some caveats. Friendship is the first comedy I've seen in a theater in quite a while that I thought was truly tapping into a cultural zeitgeist of a new era of comedy, what I considered to be elevated comedy. In a similar vein to something like Napoleon Dynamite, which I'm unsure if I saw in a theater, or The Lonely Island when they burst onto the scene, I could get a sense that some people in my theater were like, what is this? Is this supposed to be funny? And on the other hand, you had people who had been binge watching I Think You Should Leave for the last 6 years, laughing their asses off every time Tim Robinson made a dumbfounded face. Anyway, this existential threat to the studio comedy has taken the form of television and, most recently, online short-form content. I don't think it's unwise to say that there's a saturation level of comedy that makes it more difficult for feature-length comedies to stand out, number one. And number two, to make money. The whole why should I go to the theater when I could just wait until it's out on streaming crowd seems to be exacerbated when it comes to the genre of comedy in theaters. I can scroll on Instagram Reels for 85 minutes and laugh just as much, if not more, at those than I could at the new Naked Gun movie. And that's not me throwing shade at Naked Gun. It's just a fact, and one worth highlighting, so you could see what the studio comedy is competing against. I just get the impression that people like to bury their heads in the sand and pretend like they aren't contributing to the decline of studio comedies, but honestly, most of us are. And let's go back to that other elephant in the room, money. Comedy as a genre doesn't tend to look expensive, which is exactly what makes it such a hard sell in today's IP-driven studio economy. Studios are no longer betting on mid-budget movies that don't come with a built-in franchise or recognizable characters or global merchandising appeal. A movie like Bridesmaids or Superbad would have a far tougher time getting greenlit today, not because people don't want to laugh, but because comedies rarely generate the kind of international box office returns to justify a theatrical release. And unlike most superhero films, you can't just slap a Naked Gun logo on a lunchbox or license it out to Fortnite. Although maybe that's not true anymore, given one battle after another, I guess, linking up with Fortnite. But that risk-averse mentality trickles down into creative decision-making too. When the margin for error is slim, studios either lean on legacy IP, like a Naked Gun reboot, or pass on riskier original comedies altogether. That's part of what makes something like Friendship feel miraculous to me. It's not just a new voice, but it's a new voice that got a wide release in theaters without being tethered to a larger cinematic universe or decades-old brand. The result is that most contemporary comedies end up going to streaming, where the stakes are lower, but so is the impact. Theatrical comedies, once the bread and butter of multiplexes, now feel like endangered species, not because audiences have stopped laughing, but because the business model no longer prioritizes laughter as a viable return on investment. And another really interesting wrinkle in all of this is the globalization of comedy. With the rise of international streaming platforms, audiences today are more exposed than ever to comedic voices from all around the globe, whether it's a dry British series like Dairy Girls or an absurdity-heavy Australian sketch comedy show like Auntie Donna. But this also highlights how deeply local comedy can still be. What makes someone laugh in the US might fall completely flat in Germany or Japan, and vice versa. Comedy is often rooted in language, culture, rhythm, and reference points that don't always translate across borders. That makes the job of marketing and exporting a theatrical comedy even harder. Action, horror, and spectacle tend to be universal. Comedy, ironically, might be one of the most personal and untranslatable genres that we have. That's why you see so many action films that are also comedies, horror films that are also comedies, etc., etc. It's easier for international audiences if Hollywood tacks on a comedy to a genre that already has universal appeal. And to add to all of this, there's also been a noticeable decline in the rise of new mainstream comedy cinema stars. For decades, Hollywood had a pretty consistent pattern. Every 5 to 10 years, a new face would emerge to dominate the comedy landscape. Eddie Murphy, Jim Carrey, Adam Sandler, Will Ferrell, Vince Vaughn, Owen Wilson, Seth Rogen, and so on. These were performers who could open a movie on name recognition alone, often working within a signature comedic persona that audiences came to expect and flock to. But in the past 5 to 10 years, that pipeline has all but dried up. And I don't really have an explanation to that other than the decentralization of entertainment across various platforms. It's the same argument. It's a saturation problem, a step away from a monoculture. And look, this comedy saturation that I'm talking about is not inherently a bad thing. Lord knows the world sucks, and having an outlet to laugh is great. But when it gets in the way of communal laughter and perpetuates these isolationist tendencies in our society, that's when I think it becomes a problem. But there's another way of looking at this. Just to play devil's advocate for a second, I find myself pretty ticked off at the folks who only talk about how great things used to be. I have heard the phrase, they don't make them like they used to, way too often to stay quiet about it. And I do think that this mentality comes from a place of fear. Fear of aging, fear of your tastes becoming obsolete, fear of not understanding future generations. When you're young, you like to think you'll stay young forever and not be one of those old people who can't figure out how to turn on the TV. And so, to combat that feeling, we complain about things making incremental changes as we age. Oh, all the kids these days are watching Bluey and Peppa Pig. Well, back in my day, I watched Ren and Stimpy, and I turned out just fine. Okay, pal. Whatever you say. My point is, there should be a small part of us that relinquishes ourselves to the changing tides of genre filmmaking and to the ways in which we consume certain things. The so-called death of studio comedies seems scary, like an existential boogeyman coming to strip away your youth. But in the evolving technological and media landscape, we do need to ask ourselves why we're clinging so tightly to the way things used to be. And I'm aware of how this sounds. I'm not by any means saying that we need to take the comedy genre and move it out of theaters and entirely online. Believe me, I am not saying that. And what I'm also not saying is that all comedies need to reinvent the wheel. Case in point, the Naked Gun reboot. But regardless of what they decide to do, it's still important to put your money where your mouth is and vote with your wallet by seeing these things in a theater when they are available. Now, The Naked Gun is in this weird place for me because I undeniably thought it was hilarious. My whole theater did too, young and old. And I think that's the appeal of these types of films, this micro genre that was popularized in the 70s and 80s of the joke-a-minute spoof comedy. From Blazing Saddles in 1974 to the original Naked Gun in 88 to Hot Shots in 1991 to Scary Movies 1 through 4 between 2000 and 2006, the genre, in my opinion, had a really solid 30-year run that kind of got screwed over by the likes of Epic Movie, Date Movie, Disaster Movie, Meet the Spartans, and that superhero movie with Drake Bell. Remember that? My point is, these movies were funny regardless of age, class, creed, whatever. A lot of the gags that you see in these films tap into the juvenile nature of comedy. Pratfalls, sight gags, boneheaded protagonists, poop jokes, wordplay, etc. And around the 90s, it seemed like these types of jokes really made their way into a specific form of television. You all know it, the adult animated comedy. The Simpsons being the prime example of this, and it's no wonder some of the most popular episodes of The Simpsons are the Treehouse of Horror episodes, where they spoof other films and stories in a particular genre, like Cape Fear or The Shining. And then, of course, The Simpsons went on to spawn popular predecessors like Family Guy, South Park, Rick and Morty, you know the deal. And so here I am, I'm watching the new Naked Gun, and I'm laughing, and I walk out of the theater, and I do that thing that seems like the death knell for things like this, and I immediately forget the movie. It seems like it just went in one ear and out the other. And then I start saying to myself, it was funny, but will it be canonized as a comedy classic the way that the 40-Year-Old Virgin or Anchorman were? And then I really start to spiral and slap myself around a little bit as I ask myself, why that even matters? Why am I putting so much pressure on a film in the first place? And it goes back to that original question in the beginning. Does a comedy film need to be anything other than funny? And I don't know if I have an answer. I think it depends on the individual, frankly. But maybe that's okay. Maybe that's the quiet beauty of comedy, that it doesn't have to do everything all the time. It doesn't have to cure loneliness or redefine the genre or carry the burden of modern relevance. Sometimes it just needs to make a room full of strangers laugh together in the dark. That being said, I think the reason we keep asking if comedy needs to be more smarter, more politically conscious, more emotionally resonant, more elevated, is because our culture has changed. Our attention spans have splintered, our tastes have become nicheified, and the communal experiences that once defined theatrical comedy now feel pretty rare. So when one does come along, like Friendship or this new Naked Gun reboot, we overthink it. We analyze whether it's pushing boundaries or saying something capital I important, or if it's just a flash in our ever-expanding feed. Maybe that's why I felt the need to spiral afterward, because part of me still wants funny to feel important, and maybe it still is. But the danger in all of this, I think, is confusing legacy with value. Not everything funny has to be remembered forever to be worthwhile. Some laughs are just of the moment, and that doesn't make them any less real or necessary. If a joke lands, if the room erupts, if you start choking on your popcorn, that's comedy doing its job, full stop. So no, I don't think that the studio comedy is dead. I think it's changing. I think it's adapting, sometimes awkwardly, sometimes brilliantly, to a world that doesn't laugh the same way that it did 30 years ago. And while streaming, social media, and short-form content may be stealing its thunder, they're also part of the larger comedy ecosystem now. The sketch you watched on TikTok this morning, the meme you sent to a loved one, the YouTube video that your friend quoted at brunch, they're all part of the same impulse, to make us laugh, to bring some levity into the day. And in the end, I don't know where comedy goes from here. But I do know I'll keep showing up, whether it's for a Zaz reboot directed by 1/3 of The Lonely Island, an awkwardly absurd A24 farce, or a 10-second reel that makes me wheeze while I'm on my phone before bedtime. Because laughing still feels like something worth showing up for. That's going to do it for me on this video. Thank you so much for watching. Please consider hitting the subscribe button and the bell to be notified when new videos come out on the channel. Head down to the comments and let me know what you think of the state of comedy in 2025. And do you think that there was a significant shift in the way that the studio comedy was made and presented theatrically to us? I do think that since 2020, there's been a major shift. I wonder what could have sparked that. But anyway, I'm curious to hear everyone's opinions on this subject, and let me know if you think I should make more videos like this and what you would like to see me talk about on this channel. But anyway, thank you again for watching. I'll see you all next time.